Michael had been dreaming about having a pool in his backyard for years. After months of saving, he finally hired a small digging machine and began preparing the ground. It was a bright spring morning. The sun shone warmly over the quiet suburban street. Birds were singing, and a soft breeze moved the leaves on the trees. Everything seemed perfect for a day of work. Michael was strong and enjoyed working with his hands. He liked seeing the progress he made each day. At first, digging the ground was easy. The soil was soft and light. Little by little, he removed the top layer of dirt, imagining how wonderful the finished pool would look. After a few hours, the digging became harder. The soil grew heavier, and he began hitting small rocks. He pushed the machine forward, determined to keep going. As he dug deeper, he noticed the dirt smelled strange. It was damp and had a metallic scent. Michael paused and looked at the soil. "That is odd," he muttered to himself. He thought perhaps there was a broken pipe underground, or maybe some old garden tools buried long ago. Michael continued carefully, and soon his shovel hit something hard. He stopped and knelt down to examine it. He brushed away the dirt, and a chill ran down his spine. The ground had revealed a large, solid metal object. It looked like a small vehicle. Michael's heart began to beat faster. As he cleaned more dirt off, he realized it was an ambulance. It was covered in rust, its paint faded, and medical symbols barely visible. The doors were sealed shut, and it looked like it had been buried for decades. Michael could not understand how an ambulance ended up underground in his backyard. This neighborhood had always been calm and safe. There had never been any accidents or incidents that might explain it. Michael stood up, trying to control his thoughts. He felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. He wanted to see inside the ambulance, but he was afraid of what he might find. The vehicle gave him a strange feeling. It was as if it had been waiting there for someone to discover it. His neighbors had begun to notice his digging. A few people peeked over the fences, whispering among themselves. Michael waved them off. He did not want anyone interfering with the discovery. He carefully stepped back from the ambulance and took out his phone. He took several photos from different angles. Even in pictures, the ambulance looked strange and mysterious. Its presence felt unreal. After a while, Michael decided to try the doors. They were heavy and covered with rust. He pulled and pushed, but they would not budge. His hands were scratched, and the handles were slippery. He tried again and again, but it was impossible. The ambulance stayed shut. Michael stepped back, breathing heavily, and realized this was bigger than he had imagined. He knew he needed help. He called the police, carefully explaining what he had found. The officer on the phone listened quietly. "Do not touch it anymore. Stay back and wait. We will send a team to investigate," the officer said. Michael nodded, feeling both nervous and relieved. Soon, flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street. Several police cars and an emergency response vehicle arrived. Officers quickly blocked the road, preventing anyone from entering the area. Curious neighbors were asked to move back. Michael watched from a distance, his heart beating fast. A few police officers examined the ambulance. One of them tapped the metal surface with a gloved hand. "It is old," he said quietly to another officer. "Really old. Possibly buried for decades." Michael could not believe what he was hearing. The ambulance had been underground all this time? Why? Who had buried it? What could be inside? Questions raced through his mind, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. One of the officers asked Michael to give a full account. He explained how he had been digging the pool, the strange smell in the soil, and how his shovel had hit something hard. The officer nodded, taking notes. Another officer started measuring the area around the ambulance, making sure it was safe for a full investigation. Soon, a team of police with special equipment arrived. They had tools to open the ambulance carefully. The officers worked quietly, their faces serious. Michael felt a mix of fear and excitement. He could not stop looking at the ambulance, imagining what secrets it might hide. The street remained quiet except for the soft hum of the digging machines and the low murmur of police radios. Michael realized that his simple project to build a pool had turned into something much more important. The ambulance was no ordinary vehicle. Its sudden discovery had changed the calm morning into a scene of mystery and suspense. Time passed slowly. Michael stood at the edge of his backyard, watching the officers move around the ambulance. He felt a sense of unease. The vehicle seemed larger than it should be. It sat in the ground like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Every detail, from the rusted handles to the faded paint, told a story of something hidden for a long time. Finally, one of the officers spoke to Michael. "We will need to open it carefully. Please stay behind the barrier. This could be dangerous." Michael nodded and stepped back, feeling his hands sweat. He knew this was no longer just a backyard project. Something important, maybe even dangerous, was about to be revealed. Michael's neighbors watched from a safe distance, whispering among themselves. The street, usually quiet and calm, had become a scene of tension. People speculated about what might be inside the ambulance. Some thought it was abandoned equipment. Others imagined something more serious. Michael's mind wandered. He wondered about the history of the ambulance. Who had owned it? How had it ended up here? And most importantly, what secrets did it hold inside its rusted walls? The officers prepared to open the doors. They used special tools and worked slowly, making sure not to damage the vehicle or disturb anything inside. Michael felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. He could not imagine what he was about to see. As the officers continued their work, Michael stepped back to take a deep breath. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the peaceful morning had completely changed. What started as a simple day of digging had turned into a mysterious event that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. The ambulance remained still, silent, and sealed. Yet Michael could feel the tension in the air. Something inside waited to be discovered, and soon, the truth would come out. Michael knew one thing for sure: life in his quiet neighborhood would never be the same again. Michael could barely breathe as the police worked around the ambulance. The air felt heavier now, as if the quiet street itself held its breath. Officers in gloves and protective gear carefully examined the rusted metal. They used crowbars, hammers, and special cutting tools, working slowly so they would not damage the interior or disturb anything inside. Michael stayed behind the barrier, his hands gripping the fence. His heart pounded. The ambulance looked ordinary at first, but something about it made him uneasy. He remembered the damp smell from the soil, the odd darkness of the metal, and the strange silence around it. It did not feel like a normal abandoned vehicle. The first officer began prying open the side door. Rust flakes fell to the ground, and a sharp metallic smell filled the air. Michael's stomach twisted as the door creaked slowly. He imagined dust and old medical equipment inside, but part of him feared something much worse. Finally, with a loud groan, the door began to give way. The police shone their flashlights inside. The interior was dark, covered with dirt and cobwebs. Michael could see old seats, broken equipment, and medical cabinets. Everything looked worn, almost frozen in time. One officer stepped inside carefully. "It is very old," he said. "Some of this equipment could be from the 1970s or 1980s. He touched a faded stretcher and wiped some dust off. The stretcher was stained and brittle, as if it had not been touched for decades. Michael peered closer. Something inside caught his eye. There were jars and boxes on a small shelf near the back of the ambulance. They were labeled in a language Michael did not understand. The labels were yellowed with age, and the glass jars were cloudy. He wondered what had been stored inside them. Suddenly, another officer called out, "There is something under the stretcher." Michael's heart jumped. He could not see clearly, but the officer seemed serious. The team carefully moved the stretcher aside. Underneath was a small hatch, sealed with rusted bolts. The hatch looked like it had been closed for decades. The officers exchanged looks. One of them spoke quietly, but Michael could hear. This might be why it was buried. We need special permission to open it. Michael's curiosity turned into anxiety. Why would someone bury an ambulance just to hide a small hatch? What could be inside? While waiting for the proper equipment, the officers continued examining the ambulance. They checked the seats, the cabinets, and the remaining medical supplies. Everything seemed ordinary at first, but small details gave Michael chills. There were faded papers with handwriting he could not read, and broken instruments that looked too advanced for a vehicle of this age. The neighborhood was buzzing now. People stayed behind the police barriers, whispering and speculating. Michael noticed children looking from a distance, their parents holding them back. No one had ever seen anything like this before. A buried ambulance was not something anyone expected in a quiet suburban street. After nearly an hour, the team returned with more equipment. They prepared to open the hatch under the stretcher. The bolts were thick and corroded. It took careful effort to loosen them without breaking anything. Michael held his breath as the officers worked, listening to the scraping and clanking sounds. Finally, with a sharp click, the hatch opened. A musty, cold air rushed out. Michael felt a chill across his shoulders. The interior below the hatch was dark, and the beam of the officer's flashlight barely lit it. Inside, there were boxes, small wooden boxes stacked neatly. Some were labeled, but the writing was faded beyond recognition. Others had no labels at all. One officer carefully lifted a box. Inside were old medical records and papers. Michael leaned closer. The papers were brittle and yellowed with age. Names, dates, and notes were scribbled in ink that had faded almost to gray. Some pages had photographs clipped to them. The photographs were of people Michael did not recognize, but their faces looked serious, almost scared. Another box contained strange instruments. They were not the normal medical tools Michael had seen in a hospital. Some looked like they belonged to a laboratory. Small tubes, glass vials, and metal devices filled the box. Michael could not imagine why someone would hide these in an ambulance, and why bury it in the backyard. The officers continued sorting through the boxes. They worked carefully, placing each item on clean sheets to avoid contamination. Michael noticed one officer take out a small notebook. The notebook had a leather cover and was tied with a string. The pages inside were filled with neat handwriting, but some words seemed unusual, almost coded. Michael strained to see, but it was impossible from his spot behind the barrier. As they explored further, Michael noticed a small metal container in the corner of the hatch. It was locked, but the metal was thicker and newer than the rest of the ambulance. One of the officers carefully pried it open. Inside was a bundle of papers wrapped in cloth. Michael could see old receipts, letters, and photographs. Some of the letters were addressed to places far away, from cities Michael had never heard of. The police decided to bring in more personnel. They called for forensic experts to help examine the contents. Michael stepped back, feeling overwhelmed. What started as a simple backyard project had now turned into a full-scale investigation. The ambulance was more than a buried vehicle. It was a container of secrets. Hours passed. Michael watched as officers documented everything. They took photographs, recorded notes, and packed items for transport. The street remained closed, and the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. Some people speculated about crimes, while others thought it might be a historical discovery. Michael's mind could not stop racing. Who had owned the ambulance? Why had it been buried? And most importantly, what was the meaning of the papers and instruments inside? He felt as if he had stumbled into a story that no one else in the neighborhood knew. The quiet street, the calm morning, and the simple task of digging a pool had all led to something extraordinary. Finally, as the sun began to lower in the sky, the officers prepared to transport the ambulance and its contents. They carefully lifted the hatch items into boxes for the forensic lab. Michael watched as the ambulance was slowly removed from the ground. It looked different now, no longer buried, but its mysteries remained. Before leaving, one officer turned to Michael. "We will need to examine everything thoroughly. This could take weeks. You did the right thing by calling us, he said. Michael nodded. He felt relieved, but also anxious. He could not stop thinking about the things he had seen inside the ambulance. As the police drove away, the street remained quiet again. But the sense of normalcy was gone. Michael realized that his life, and the lives of everyone in the neighborhood, would be different from this day onward. The buried ambulance was only the beginning. Something about it, and the secrets it held, would soon change everything. Michael walked back to his backyard, staring at the hole where the ambulance had been. The soil was still damp, and the metallic smell lingered faintly. He wondered about the people in the photographs, the letters, and the instruments. Every piece seemed to have a story, and he knew that one day, the truth would be revealed. For now, he could only wait and wonder. The ambulance had been opened, but its secrets were far from fully understood. Michael knew that what he had discovered was extraordinary. A simple morning of digging had turned into a mystery that no one could have imagined. After the ambulance was removed from the ground, Michael tried to return to his normal life, but he could not stop thinking about what had been inside. The strange jars, old instruments, and faded papers had left a heavy impression on him. He kept asking himself questions he could not answer. Why was an ambulance buried in his backyard? Who had hidden it? And most importantly, what secrets did it hold? A few days later, the police returned with a forensic team. They brought special equipment to examine the ambulance more carefully. Michael was allowed to watch from a safe distance, though the officers kept him behind the police tape. He felt both anxious and curious. Something about this investigation felt larger than life, as if it had been waiting for him to find it. The forensic team began with the interior of the ambulance. They wore gloves, masks, and protective suits, carefully handling every item. They sorted the old papers, instruments, and boxes, documenting everything in photographs and notes. Michael noticed that some of the items were stored in jars filled with strange liquids. The liquids were dark and murky, and the labels had faded so much that he could not read them. One of the officers picked up an old medical bag. It was dusty and covered in cobwebs, but inside were small tools neatly arranged. Michael felt a chill when he saw them. Some looked like simple medical instruments, but others were unusual, with small metal parts that seemed complicated to use. He wondered who had used them and for what purpose. Then the team focused on the small hatch under the stretcher. The boxes they had moved before were carefully opened. This time, the forensic experts examined the letters, photographs, and notebooks more closely. Michael noticed one officer flipping through the small leather notebook he had seen before. The officer frowned and whispered to another. Michael's curiosity piqued. Something inside the notebook had caught their attention. Suddenly, one of the officers shouted. Michael's heart jumped. "You need to see this," the officer called. Michael stepped closer, though the police tape kept him at a distance. The officer held up a photograph. It showed a person, dressed in an old medical uniform, standing next to a patient on a stretcher. The photograph looked like it had been taken decades ago. But what made it shocking was the expression on the patient's face. It was terrified, as if they had been in danger. The forensic team found more photographs and documents that told a troubling story. Some papers seemed to be medical reports, but the handwriting was difficult to read. Others were letters that spoke of experiments and tests, though the words were vague and mysterious. Michael could not understand much, but he felt a growing sense of unease. Something about these items did not belong in a normal ambulance. As the team continued, they discovered a small metal box hidden under the floor of the ambulance. The box was locked and reinforced, unlike anything else they had seen. One officer carefully pried it open. Inside were dozens of small files, each labeled with names and dates. Some were photographs, some were notes, and some were small objects wrapped in cloth. Michael could see that many of the papers were old, yellowed with age, but the writing was meticulous. The forensic officer examined one file and gasped. Michael could not hear the words, but he saw the officer's face pale. Another officer came over and began looking through the files. The mood around the ambulance changed. What had seemed like a historical curiosity was now something far more serious. Michael felt a tight knot in his stomach. Whatever the team had found was not ordinary. One officer spoke to Michael. "These files, they contain names of people, dates, and locations. Some of the information suggests that this ambulance was used for something very unusual, possibly illegal. We need to investigate further before we can say anything for certain." Michael's mind raced. He could not imagine what these records meant. How could a buried ambulance hold such secrets? While the team worked, Michael noticed something else. The instruments in one of the boxes were arranged strangely. Some were marked with symbols he did not recognize. Others were wrapped carefully in cloth, as if someone had wanted to hide them from view. The careful arrangement made Michael think that whoever had buried the ambulance had done so intentionally, to hide not only the vehicle but also its contents. Hours passed, and the forensic team continued sorting the items. They took photographs, scanned documents, and carefully stored the objects in secure boxes. Michael watched silently, feeling both fascinated and afraid. He could not stop thinking about the people in the photographs and the letters. Who were they? Were they in danger? And why had this ambulance been buried here? Later, one of the officers approached Michael. "We have found something in the metal box that is very unusual," he said quietly. "It appears to be a record of people who were transported by this ambulance decades ago. Some of the cases are very strange. We cannot explain them yet, but we need experts to review the information." Michael nodded, though he did not fully understand. The discovery had become more mysterious than he could have imagined. As the sun began to set, the police and forensic team packed up their equipment. The ambulance and its contents were transported to a secure location for further investigation. Michael felt a mixture of relief and frustration. He had found the ambulance, but the real answers were still unknown. He knew that whatever secrets it held would not be revealed quickly. Michael walked back to his backyard, looking at the empty hole where the ambulance had been buried. The ground was still damp, and a faint metallic smell lingered in the air. He thought about the photographs, the letters, and the strange instruments. Every item seemed to tell a story, but the story was incomplete. That night, Michael could not sleep. He kept thinking about the terrified faces in the photographs and the careful arrangement of the instruments. Something about the discovery felt heavy, almost as if it carried a warning. He wondered who had buried the ambulance and why. Was it to hide crimes, protect secrets, or prevent danger? The next morning, Michael received a call from the police. They thanked him for reporting the ambulance and asked him to stay available for further questions. Michael agreed. He felt proud that he had done the right thing, but he also felt anxious. The mystery of the buried ambulance had changed his life. His quiet neighborhood, his simple backyard project, had become the center of a story far bigger than he could imagine. Michael returned to the backyard and looked at the hole once more. He thought about the people who had been connected to the ambulance, and he realized that their stories were still buried with it. The ambulance had been removed, but its secrets were far from revealed. Michael understood one thing clearly: the discovery was only the beginning. The buried ambulance was more than an old vehicle. It was a link to something hidden, something that had waited decades to be uncovered. Michael knew that the coming days would bring answers, but he also knew that some mysteries might never be fully explained. He took a deep breath and decided to focus on his pool project again. But deep down, Michael knew that the ambulance and its secrets would never leave his thoughts. Something extraordinary had happened in his backyard, and his life, and the lives of everyone in the neighborhood, had been changed forever. Michael could not stop thinking about the buried ambulance. Days had passed since the discovery, but the memory of the strange instruments, the old letters, and the photographs haunted him. Even while trying to focus on building his pool, he kept glancing at the backyard, imagining what else the ambulance might have contained. Meanwhile, the police had taken the ambulance and its contents to a secure laboratory. Forensic experts and historians worked together to examine every item in detail. Michael had been told he could not visit, but the police promised to keep him informed. He spent hours waiting for updates, each phone call adding more questions than answers. One morning, Michael received a call from Officer Daniels, the lead investigator. "Michael," the officer said, "we have discovered something very unusual in the ambulance. You need to hear this carefully." Michael's heart raced. "Go ahead," he said. The officer explained that among the old papers and medical files, they had found detailed records of people who had been treated and transported decades ago. Most were ordinary medical cases, but some were very unusual. The files described mysterious illnesses, treatments that did not match conventional medicine, and cases where patients had disappeared after being transported. The ambulance seemed to have been used for more than normal emergencies. Michael felt a chill. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" he asked. Officer Daniels paused. "We are still investigating, but it appears some people were moved secretly by this ambulance. The reasons are unclear. Some notes mention special research and unusual experiments. We are bringing in experts to review everything." Michael's mind raced. Could an ambulance really hide such secrets for decades? How had no one noticed? Later that day, Michael received another call. The forensic team had examined the strange instruments more closely. Some were simple medical tools, but others were highly specialized devices. Their purpose was not immediately clear, but they did not resemble normal hospital equipment. Experts suspected they were used for careful observation and testing, perhaps in ways that were not widely known at the time. Michael's curiosity turned into worry. Who had owned this ambulance? Why had it been buried? The more he learned, the more the mystery deepened. He realized that what had started as a simple backyard project was now part of something much larger and more complicated. As the police continued their investigation, Michael began talking to his neighbors. Some of them had noticed the strange activities and the police presence in the street. Most were curious, some were anxious, but everyone agreed that this discovery was extraordinary. Michael listened to their stories of old times, trying to find connections. Yet no one had ever seen an ambulance buried nearby, and no one remembered any missing vehicles or equipment. One evening, Michael was sitting in his backyard when Officer Daniels called again. "Michael, we have found something important," the officer said. Inside one of the boxes, there were letters from someone named Dr. Rowan. The letters suggest that the ambulance was used to secretly transport patients for research. Some of the cases were medical, but others were unusual, involving rare conditions and experiments that were never published. "We are trying to find more information about Dr. Rowan and his work." Michael felt a mixture of fear and fascination. The ambulance was no longer just an old vehicle. It was a link to hidden history, a story that had been buried with it for decades. He imagined Dr. Rowan, working quietly, moving patients in secrecy, keeping records that only now were being discovered. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. Michael watched the news, hoping for updates. Experts examined the photographs, instruments, and files. Historians tried to trace Dr. Rowan's life, and medical professionals analyzed the strange devices. Michael learned that the ambulance had been a mobile unit for research and transport, hidden for reasons that were still unclear. One afternoon, Officer Daniels called Michael again. "We may have found living connections," he said. "Some relatives of people mentioned in the files are still alive. We are contacting them to see if they can provide information about the ambulance and Dr. Rowan's work." Michael's mind raced. Could the ambulance's mystery connect to living people? Could they help explain why it was buried in his backyard? While all this was happening, Michael tried to return to normal life. He worked on his pool, but every sound in the backyard reminded him of the ambulance. Every shadow felt like a secret waiting to be discovered. Yet, he also felt proud. His decision to call the police had brought a hidden story to light. He had discovered something extraordinary, something that had remained hidden for decades. The police and forensic teams continued to uncover small details. They found more photographs, old medical charts, and instruments that were carefully labeled. Each discovery added to the growing story of Dr. Rowan and the patients transported by the ambulance. Michael realized that history was alive in his backyard, hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be revealed. One evening, Michael received another update. Officer Daniels explained that some files mentioned unusual routes taken by the ambulance, moving patients to secret locations. The notes were detailed, suggesting careful planning and intentional secrecy. The ambulance had not been buried by accident. Someone had wanted to hide it, to protect its contents from discovery. Michael felt a shiver. Who had buried it, and why? Was it Dr. Rowan himself, or someone else? The more he learned, the more he realized that the ambulance held not only medical history but also a story of secrecy, hidden decisions, and mystery. As the investigation progressed, Michael noticed a change in the neighborhood. People spoke quietly about the ambulance, respecting the police work, but also imagining the possibilities. Children played nearby, unaware of the secret buried in the earth weeks before. Michael wondered how many other hidden stories existed in the world, waiting to be discovered. By now, Michael had accepted that the ambulance's discovery had changed his life. He could no longer see his backyard as a simple space for a pool. It was a place where history, mystery, and secrets had intersected. The ambulance had revealed more than instruments and letters. It had revealed a story of hidden lives, careful planning, and forgotten decisions. One evening, as Michael walked through his backyard, he thought about what the future might hold. The forensic team had promised to share more findings as they progressed. He knew that each day could bring new surprises, new revelations. The buried ambulance had awakened a mystery that would not be solved quickly. Michael also realized that he had learned something important about curiosity, responsibility, and the past. By calling the police and reporting his discovery, he had allowed history to be uncovered. The ambulance, once hidden in the earth, was now part of a larger story, connecting the past to the present. As the sun set, Michael looked at the spot where the ambulance had been buried. The soil had been filled in, the backyard returned to its normal appearance, but Michael knew the truth. The story of the ambulance and Dr. Rowan's work would continue to unfold. The mystery was far from over. Michael took a deep breath. He had discovered something extraordinary, something that went beyond a simple backyard project. The ambulance had been hidden for decades, carrying secrets that were finally being revealed. And Michael knew one thing for certain: the story was only getting more intense, and the coming days would bring discoveries that no one could have imagined. Weeks had passed since Michael discovered the buried ambulance in his backyard. The police, forensic experts, and historians had continued their work, examining every item removed from the old vehicle. Michael had followed every update closely, feeling a mix of curiosity, fear, and anticipation. He knew that the story of the ambulance was far from ordinary, and he wondered if he would ever understand why it had been hidden for so long. One morning, Michael received a call from Officer Daniels. His voice sounded serious but calm. "Michael, we are ready to share our findings. We believe we now understand the full story behind the ambulance. You might want to hear this carefully." Michael's heart raced. "I am ready," he replied. Officer Daniels began explaining. The ambulance had been owned by a man named Dr. Rowan, a medical professional who worked during the 1960s and 1970s. His work involved transporting patients who were part of medical research, but it was not ordinary research. Many patients had rare illnesses or conditions that doctors at the time could not explain. Dr. Rowan wanted to study these cases carefully, often moving patients in secret to prevent panic or interference. Michael listened closely. "So, the ambulance was used for research?" he asked. "Yes," Officer Daniels said. "But it was more than that. The ambulance also carried documents, instruments, and records that were sensitive. Some of the experiments involved rare treatments that were experimental at the time. Dr. Rowan wanted to keep everything private. It seems that after a certain point, he realized that his work might be misunderstood or misused. So, the ambulance was buried carefully to protect the patient's identities and his research." Michael felt a mix of relief and awe. The ambulance was not evidence of crime, but a secret history, hidden for decades. The fear and mystery that had surrounded the discovery now made sense. Someone had buried it to protect knowledge and people. Officer Daniels continued. We contacted relatives of some of the patients mentioned in the records. Many of them had little knowledge of Dr. Rowan's work. Some were shocked, but they were grateful that the information was finally discovered and preserved. The ambulance contained not only history but also proof of care and effort to protect people who were vulnerable. Michael nodded slowly. He felt a strange pride. His backyard project had uncovered something important, something that had been hidden for decades to keep people safe. What had begun as a strange and frightening discovery had now turned into a story of compassion and protection. Later, Michael visited the police station, where the ambulance and its contents had been taken for permanent examination. He could see the items arranged carefully on tables: old instruments, yellowed papers, photographs, and jars. Forensic experts explained each item. Some instruments were rare and no longer used. The letters and notebooks detailed treatments, patient histories, and Dr. Rowan's careful notes. Everything was organized, studied, and preserved. Michael picked up a photograph. It showed Dr. Rowan smiling gently at a patient lying on a stretcher inside the ambulance. The patient seemed calm and safe, and the image gave Michael a sense of peace. This was not a vehicle of fear or danger, but one of care and careful attention. As the expert spoke, Michael learned that Dr. Rowan had passed away many years ago, but his work had influenced other medical research quietly. Some of the patients mentioned in the files had survived and lived full lives, thanks in part to his care. The secrecy of the ambulance had been a necessary measure at the time, protecting both patients and the integrity of the research. Michael realized how extraordinary this was. An ordinary backyard had concealed a story that spanned decades, involved real people, and carried lessons about responsibility, secrecy, and care. What seemed frightening at first had become a revelation of history and humanity. Later that evening, Michael returned home. His backyard, once the site of digging and discovery, now felt ordinary again. The soil where the ambulance had been buried was smooth and neat. The pool project was ready to continue. But Michael knew that his life had changed. He could no longer see the world in a simple way. There were hidden stories everywhere, waiting for someone curious enough to uncover them. That night, Michael thought about Dr. Rowan. He imagined the doctor preparing the ambulance, carefully packing instruments and files, and thinking about the patients he needed to protect. Michael felt respect for the man's dedication and wisdom. It was remarkable to think that someone could work so quietly and secretly to protect others. In the coming weeks, the police and historians worked on preserving the records permanently. Museums and archives were interested in the documents, photographs, and instruments. Michael followed the updates with interest. The ambulance itself became part of a historical exhibition, showing how careful study, secrecy, and compassion had been balanced in Dr. Rowan's work. Michael shared his story with the neighborhood. At first, people were skeptical, but once the full truth was revealed, they were amazed. His discovery had turned the quiet street into a place of history. Children were fascinated by the story, and adults spoke about it with respect. Michael realized that the ambulance had brought the community together in curiosity and learning. One afternoon, Michael finally returned to the pool project. As he worked, he reflected on the journey from a simple backyard project to a historical revelation. He smiled, thinking about how a hidden ambulance had changed his understanding of the past and the present. He realized that sometimes, extraordinary stories could be found in the most ordinary places. Michael also felt grateful. He had acted responsibly when he discovered the ambulance, calling the police and allowing experts to handle the investigation. His actions had preserved history, helped protect identities, and brought a hidden story to light. He knew that had he ignored it or tried to explore it alone, much of the truth might have been lost. As the sun set over the backyard, Michael looked at the smooth ground where the ambulance had been buried. Soon, the pool would be finished, and life would return to normal in the neighborhood. But the memory of the ambulance, Dr. Rowan, and the hidden stories would stay with him forever. Michael understood that discovery was more than finding objects, It was about uncovering stories, protecting truths, and learning from the past. The ambulance had been a reminder of the unknown, the hidden, and the importance of careful attention. It had shown him that even ordinary people could become part of extraordinary stories. Finally, Michael stepped back and admired his work. The pool would soon be filled with water, reflecting the sky and trees above. Yet, in his mind, the reflection reminded him of something else. The buried ambulance, the careful work of Dr. Rowan, and the lives quietly touched by someone who had acted with care and courage.